The single mother in San Francisco, Maggie Johnson had always dreamed of building a warm, loving family in the heart of San Francisco. After moving across states with nothing but her college diploma and a hopeful smile, she carved out a life for herself in a cozy, tree-lined neighborhood just outside the buzz of downtown. Her apartment, modest but filled with light and Ethan's laughter, became her safe haven. Raising Ethan alone hadn't been part of Maggie's original plan. She'd pictured a partner by her side, shared responsibilities, mutual encouragement through life's highs and lows. But real life threw her a curveball. When her then-husband, Eric, walked out on her and their infant son, Maggie's world was shattered. Months blurred together in a haze of court hearings, hurried daycare pickups, and late-night grocery runs. Bills stacked up, friends drifted away, and the silence at home grew so thick she could almost touch it. Despite the heartbreak and uncertainty, Maggie never lost sight of what mattered most: Ethan's happiness and well-being. Her mornings began early, often with Ethan tugging at her hair or sleepily crawling into her bed. Together, they invented little rituals: Saturday morning pancakes, afternoon walks down bustling Clement Street, whispered bedtime stories about adventures among the city's painted Victorian houses. In Ethan's eyes, San Francisco was a world of possibilities, and Maggie was determined to keep it that way for him. Juggling two jobs, serving coffee at a local cafe, and managing accounts from her laptop after hours, Maggie learned to stretch every dollar. She became an expert in patience and resourcefulness, knowing which parks had community events, which grocery stores offered double coupons, and where Ethan could join story hours for free. Neighbors sometimes offered help, but Maggie took pride in handling things herself. She wanted Ethan to look back one day and see his mother as someone who had never given up, no matter how steep the climb. At school, pickups, and parent-teacher meetings, Maggie became known for her warm smile and quick wit. Even though she nursed private wounds of betrayal and loneliness, she refused to let bitterness define her. Instead, she taught Ethan compassion and resilience. When he asked about his absent father, she answered honestly, choosing words that would nurture hope rather than resentment. By every external measure, Maggie was holding it together. Yet beneath the surface, there were moments of self-doubt, wondering whether her love was enough, or if she was truly giving Ethan the foundation he deserved. On the hardest days, she reminded herself, love had brought her this far, and it would carry them forward. As seasons changed and golden fog settled over San Francisco's hills, Maggie's bond with Ethan only strengthened. In that compact apartment, filled with sunlight and secondhand furniture, a mother and son built their own definition of family, one grounded in sacrifice, forgiveness, and a quiet, enduring strength. The news of her ex-husband's remarriage. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, just when the brisk San Francisco breeze had started hinting at autumn. Maggie was standing at her kitchen counter, sifting through Ethan's school papers and pondering what to make for dinner when her phone buzzed with a call from a number she hadn't saved but still recognized. It was Linda, a college friend she hadn't spoken to in years, one who had moved in different circles after Maggie's divorce. After some brief small talk, Linda's voice took on a gossipy edge, and she delivered her news without warning. Did you know Eric is getting married again?
Yes,
To Catherine Bell, the entrepreneur, the words seemed to hang in the air. Maggie felt the familiar ache of old wounds, pressed by the sting of hearing about Eric moving on so publicly. She managed a polite response, though her mind was racing. Catherine Bell, her name alone evoked images of success, power, and wealth. She had seen Catherine's face on billboards for local charities and splashed across magazine covers featuring the city's most influential women. As Maggie hung up, conflicting emotions clashed inside her. She wasn't surprised that Eric had managed to charm someone wealthy and accomplished. He had always been full of grand plans and easy charisma. But the realization that Ethan's father was about to start a new life, with all the resources Maggie had worked so hard to give their son, cut deep. She suddenly wondered what this would mean for Ethan. Would he be a welcome part of Eric's new life, or just a piece of unfinished business? The days following that phone call were marked by a swirl of rumors and subtle shifts in Maggie's orbit. At Ethan's school, other parents whispered about the high-profile engagement, and some cast sideways glances her way, as if she were a tabloid headline herself. Maggie kept her composure, never letting those around her see the turmoil she felt. She resolved not to let Eric's choices affect her sense of self-worth or her dedication to Ethan. Ethan, for his part, began to ask questions he never had before, about where his dad lived, about the mysterious Catherine. Maggie answered with gentle honesty, careful not to let her own doubts color her son's perception of family. She was determined that any changes would not take away the small, precious normalcy she had built for them. As the wedding date approached, invites and announcements began circulating on social media and in local press. Maggie's phone buzzed again and again with notifications, as if the universe refused to let her ignore this new chapter that hadn't included her. Through it all, she maintained her grace, finding solace on evening walks under the city's amber streetlights, with Ethan's small hand stubbornly holding on to hers, while the city around her buzzed with the spectacle of Eric's impending marriage. Maggie quietly processed the news. Instead of resentment, she slowly felt something firmer take shape, a renewed sense of resolve to protect her son, regardless of what that future might hold. The truth behind the happy family. For a while, after the initial shock of Eric's engagement settled, Maggie tried to focus on Ethan, her work, and the rhythms of life she had carefully rebuilt. Yet, a subtle anxiety lingered beneath the surface. Each day layered with questions she did her best to quiet. She noticed, with growing unease, a change in Eric's behavior. He became more present, suddenly eager to pick Ethan up for weekend visits, sometimes arriving with expensive gifts or elaborate plans. At first, Maggie hoped that perhaps fatherhood was finally taking root in him. Maybe the prospect of a new marriage had inspired Eric to build a bridge to the son he had for so long neglected. But the feeling didn't last. Something about Eric's renewed interest felt rehearsed, performative. He was quick to take photos of himself and Ethan at the park, always asking Maggie for updates on school achievements, as if collecting proof. During one drop-off, after forcing a smile through another stilted conversation, Maggie caught sight of Catherine's luxury car idling at the curb. She waved politely as Catherine offered a hurried, disinterested nod. The brief encounter left Maggie uneasy, not because of jealousy, but because she sensed that Ethan had become a prop in someone else's story. Events unfolded quickly. One day, a thick envelope arrived in Maggie's battered mailbox, a letter from Eric's attorney, printed on heavy, expensive paper. The message was devastatingly clear. Eric was petitioning for full custody of Ethan. Maggie's hands trembled as she read through the legal jargon, her heart thudding in her chest. The stated reason: Eric could provide a more stable and prosperous household, thanks in no small part to his imminent marriage to Catherine Bell. Thunderstruck and suddenly breathless, Maggie sat at her small kitchen table, the same one where she and Ethan ate pancakes on Saturdays and tried to process the reality before her. After years of absence, Eric wanted to take Ethan away, not because he missed his son, but because Ethan would complete the facade of a perfect family in the public eye and possibly shore up his position in Catherine's world, where image meant everything. The days that followed were a blur of panic and strategizing. Maggie knew, of course, that Eric hadn't become a new man overnight. Past experience had taught her to be cautious. During their marriage, Eric had always been skilled at playing roles and telling people what they wanted to hear. Now, with Catherine, it seemed his greatest performance yet was underway. She recalled snippets of overheard conversation or words Ethan repeated innocently after visits. "Daddy says soon you'll get to live in a big house with us," or "Catherine thinks I should try the private school." Maggie steeled herself, determined not to let fear or anger cloud her judgment. She spent nights poring over legal documents, researching family law, and meeting with her attorney in cramped offices after Ethan had gone to bed. For the first time, she realized how daunting it was to fight someone with resources. Eric now had powerful legal backing and a new family's fortune behind him. Early on, she confided in her friend Susan, who worked in social services. Susan didn't sugarcoat the situation. "You'll need more than love, Maggie. You'll need proof, real evidence that Ethan's best interest is with you." This advice became her guiding principle. Maggie began methodically documenting every interaction. She saved messages from Eric. Each time he pushed for weekends that conflicted with Ethan's sports events or recitals, every time he brought gifts that Ethan didn't want or need, messages where he alluded to Catherine's preferences about how Ethan should be raised. She started to notice a pattern. Eric seemed to care less about how Ethan really felt and more about how they looked as a family. One evening, after Ethan had gone to sleep, Maggie found herself scrolling through Eric's social media. There, dozens of carefully curated photos. The three of them, Eric, Catherine, and Ethan, at charity galas, at the country club, all beaming for the camera. In the comments, people congratulated them on becoming a beautiful blended family. Yet, Maggie knew the truth in Ethan's quiet reluctance before each visit, his complaints about the uncomfortable tuxedo required for formal parties, his confusion over why Daddy always wants a picture. It was around this time that the whispers began. Other parents at Ethan's school, emboldened by tabloid headlines and local gossip columns, started to mutter things behind Maggie's back. Wouldn't Ethan be better off in that big new house? Maybe she's just holding on out of spite. Maggie kept her head high, but the judgments stung. She worried late into the night that the narrative was already slipping out of her control. As Maggie pieced together the evidence, she began to see the outline of Eric's plan. With Ethan by his side, Eric would present the image of a doting father, which not only appealed to Catherine's philanthropic, family-oriented brand, but also protected his standing in their forthcoming prenup. To lose custody now would be more than a personal defeat for Eric. It would undercut his reputation, possibly cost him access to Catherine's wealth, and most importantly, spoil the illusion of happiness that he worked so hard to project. Despite her fears, Maggie never let herself lose sight of Ethan in the storm. She shielded him from adult worries, managing her emotions so the boys' daily rituals stayed intact. Saturdays still meant pancakes. Bedtimes still included whispered stories and dreams for the future. Only after Ethan was asleep would Maggie let her guard down, crying softly, then gathering herself for the fight ahead. She also saw subtle changes in Ethan. He became more withdrawn after visits to Eric and Catherine's. Some days, he seemed jumpy, exhausted by the endless demands, to smile for the camera and blend into a world that wasn't his. Once, in the quiet darkness of his bedroom, he confessed to Maggie, "I like it better here with you, Mom. I don't have to pretend so much." That sentence, more than any legal counsel, galvanized her resolve. She realized her son didn't need a mansion. He needed authenticity, safety, and the ordinary magic of their small, imperfect family. Determined, Maggie meticulously collected her records, texts arranging inconvenient visits, emails boasting of money and material things, even voicemails from Eric when he slipped and let frustration, not fatherly concern, color his language. She had Susan help her document everything: dates, times, discrepancies between Eric's claims and what actually transpired. Maggie's attorney reassured her that the truth, carefully documented, could stand up to Eric's staged performances. Meanwhile, Eric's ambition seemed to know no bounds. He pressed further, pushing for overnight stays, even when Ethan had nightmares afterward, voicing complaints when Maggie wanted to keep Ethan's routine stable. Through mutual acquaintances, Maggie learned that Eric was telling colleagues and friends how hard it was working with his ex-wife, painting himself as the reasonable parent and Maggie as the obstacle. For Eric, it all came back to perception. At moments, Maggie faltered. Shame and anger threatened to overwhelm her, especially when she imagined losing Ethan to a household she didn't trust or even recognize. But late one night, as the city's fog rolled past her window, Maggie realized that she alone stood between her son and a future defined by appearances. She thought of all the times Ethan had come to her for comfort, all the quiet laughter and gentle wisdom they shared, and she understood that parenthood was worth fighting for, not for money, not for pride, but for the messy, beautiful truth of loving a child. As the custody case loomed ever larger in her life, Maggie began to see the truth behind the idea of a happy family. It wasn't found in glossy photos or expensive addresses. It was in bedtime stories, inside jokes, and the unwavering trust that Ethan placed in her every day. Eric might have been building something that looked perfect from the outside, but Maggie knew her bond with Ethan was real, and that was a truth worth defending at any cost. The silent legal battle. Maggie Johnson had never imagined herself as the lead player in a drawn-out courtroom drama. Years ago, when she and Eric had signed their divorce papers in a sterile county office, she'd believed their chapter was closed, at least legally. She expected co-parenting challenges, awkward encounters at school functions, maybe the rare, tense disagreement. But the idea of fighting for her son's future in a courtroom filled Maggie with a deep and constant dread. The envelope from Eric's attorney had arrived without warning, thick with legalese, and messy with implications. In it, Eric petitioned for sole custody of Ethan, supporting his case with slick affidavits and glowing references to his new, stable household. There were photos of Ethan at charity balls, in birthday parties, with Catherine and her well-heeled friends. There were reports from expensive, private social workers, people Maggie had never met, who claimed to have witnessed a thriving, blended family environment. Once the shock wore off, Maggie's first calls were to a legal clinic, then to a small firm specializing in family law. Money was tight. Maggie scraped together her savings, let her part-time job at the cafe stretch for extra hours, and even sold off a few household items online. She met her lawyer, Carmen Lopez, late into the evening after putting Ethan to bed. Carmen was sharp, pragmatic, and honest about their odds. "You're up against a lot, Maggie. Connections, money, public opinion. But that doesn't mean you're out." The process moved with clinical formality, court summonses, mediation requests, demands for documentation of every facet of Maggie and Ethan's life. Eric's legal team seemed to treat every aspect of Maggie's world as fair game, from the condition of her apartment to her financial records from years prior. They requested statements from Ethan's teachers, notes from pediatricians, affidavits from neighbors. Word of the custody fight circled the school community like wildfire. Maggie felt it everywhere she went. The lingering stares at drop-off, the charged silences around the soccer field. Other parents, many charmed by Eric's newfound polish, and perhaps starstruck by Catherine's societal standing, quietly questioned if Ethan might be better off. Some accused Maggie of being selfish, of clinging too tightly out of spite or jealousy. Maggie heard the whispers. She swallowed her pride, kept her composure, and tried to shield Ethan from the gathering storm. Every morning and night, she maintained their routines: pancake breakfasts, park outings, bedtime stories, as if their lives weren't under a microscope. She fought to keep Ethan's world intact, even as her own felt increasingly under siege. The hardest moments came from Ethan himself, his confusion, his gradual awareness that something major was happening. He noticed the stack of papers on Maggie's desk, the whispered grown-up phone calls, the way she watched him a little more closely. Some nights, Ethan asked, "Are we going to move, Mom? Am I going to live with Dad more?" Maggie answered honestly, hugging him tight, explaining only that she was trying to make sure he'd be safe and happy wherever he was. Throughout the process, Maggie leaned on a few stalwart friends. Susan, her confidant from the social services office, gave Maggie both moral support and practical advice. Write everything down. Be specific. Let the truth tell the story. They reviewed emails, cataloged messages, and gathered evidence of what day-to-day life with Ethan really looked like. Meanwhile, Carmen led the case with the precision of a surgeon. She filed motions to have Ethan interviewed by a neutral child psychologist. She obtained school reports and testimonials from teachers who knew Ethan well. Maggie was deeply involved in preparation. She wrote a narrative of her everyday life, describing Ethan's favorite snacks, daily routines, how she handled doctor appointments and sick days. It felt intimate, almost invasive, to lay all that out for strangers to judge. But Maggie pushed through for Ethan's sake. Eric's team didn't let up. They produced spreadsheets of their lavish lifestyle, the square footage of Catherine's house, the proximity to prestigious private academies, the access to tutors, travel, and health specialists. Their filings reflected their privilege at every turn. Eric himself paraded through courtrooms and mediation sessions with an air of practiced ease, always deferential, but subtly accusatory, painting Maggie as well-meaning but struggling. He emphasized the opportunities Ethan would have under his roof. Behind closed doors, Maggie and Carmen strategized. They anticipated every move, every accusation. Carmen encouraged Maggie to remain composed, even when Eric's side played to the gallery. Don't rise to their bait. You're Ethan's only constant. Show the court what matters most. The fight went on for months. Hearings blurred together in Maggie's mind. The smell of polished wood in conference rooms, the murmurs of lawyers haggling in hallways, the relentless fatigue that settled into her bones. Maggie felt hollowed out at times, but flashes of resolve kept her moving. The sound of Ethan's laughter, his hand in hers, the private smiles they shared on the way to school. There was no dramatic confrontation, no single showdown that would decide everything. The legal battle was, as Carmen warned, a slow war of attrition. There were meetings where Maggie was asked, sometimes sharply, why she insisted on keeping Ethan with her when objectively better options existed. Sometimes the questions felt personal, about her finances, her dating life, her every lapse in judgment. But Maggie countered with something Eric's side could never manufacture: a narrative of real, lived love. She furnished journals, photos, school projects, the testimony of teachers and family friends who'd seen the bond between mother and son. The psychologist's report didn't help. A careful note about Ethan's anxiety after overnight visits to Eric's, his longing for normalcy, his expressed happiness with Maggie. Carmen was relentless, refusing to let Eric's narrative go unchallenged. She questioned Eric on his schedule, his sudden interest in custody after years of minimal involvement. She asked about motivations. What had changed so suddenly that Eric wanted to be a full-time father? When pushed, Eric grew defensive, sometimes stumbling over answers, sometimes falling back on rehearsed praises for Catherine and her generosity. Through it all, Maggie kept herself together, if not always for her own sake, then for Ethan's. She learned to compartmentalize, to cry only after Ethan slept, to gather her courage anew with every sunrise. Small victories, an encouraging word from a teacher, a hug from Ethan, a moment of laughter after a hard day, sustained her spirit. As the months dragged on, the weight of the legal fight began to show on everyone. Even Eric's facade seemed to slip when out of the spotlight. His gestures with Ethan forced, his small talk brittle. But Maggie never let bitterness take center stage. Her lawyer remarked more than once, "You're the only one here thinking first of Ethan, not yourself. Don't underestimate how much that matters." In the end, the silent legal battle was not just about statutes and affidavits, but about endurance and belief in herself, in her son, and in the idea that family isn't built on appearances, but on trust and sacrificial love. Maggie emerged from every hearing steadier than before, bolstered by the truth that, win or lose, she had never stopped fighting for what truly mattered: Ethan's well-being. While the final decision still loomed, Maggie felt a sense of hard-earned pride. She had not just weathered the battle, she had given Ethan a living example of resilience, courage, and quiet strength in the face of daunting odds, quietly gathering evidence. Through months of court hearings and emotional storms, Maggie Johnson learned that courage sometimes hides in ordinary acts of diligence. While Eric leveraged his resources, dazzling the court with photographs and recommendations, Maggie became quietly methodical, piecing together a mosaic of truth to safeguard Ethan's future. She knew her love for her son was genuine. Now she needed to prove it in a system easily dazzled by status and appearances. Unlike Eric's flashy rhetoric and public gestures, Maggie operated in silence. Each day, after putting Ethan to bed, she would sit at the kitchen table beneath the worn glow of a lamp. Fragments of her life fanned out before her. Texts, emails, receipts, Ethan's art projects and school achievements. Evidence not only of her devotion, but of Eric's shifting priorities. It didn't come naturally. Maggie sometimes felt like a detective in her own life, and the labor of documenting every slight and every kindness weighed on her heart. But Carmen, her lawyer, continually reminded her, "Judges won't see your daily sacrifices unless you show them. The truth needs a record." At first, the evidence was subtle, occasional oddities that most would brush aside. Eric's abrupt requests, always at the last minute, to alter visitation schedules so Ethan could appear at social events orchestrated by Catherine. Instagram snapshots plastered with hashtags about family. When Maggie knew Ethan had begged to stay home for soccer practice, she began storing copies of every digital communication, flagging messages that hinted at Eric's priorities. Catherine thinks Ethan would look so sharp in these suits for the party. Or, let's try to have him over this weekend. The photographer's scheduled, and everyone will be there. Determined to protect Ethan's routine and emotional health, Maggie also started a simple journal. In these pages, she documented Ethan's moods before and after visits to Eric's. The excitement, followed sometimes by confusion or visible fatigue. She recorded incidents that might seem trivial in isolation, but painted a pattern over time. Ethan's withdrawal after posing for endless pictures, his reluctance to talk about what he did in Catherine's grand mansion. Sometimes, Maggie heard herself narrating into her phone's recorder late at night, recounting the delicate conversations where Ethan expressed wanting to return home to simplicity. Strongly aware of privacy lines, Maggie resisted any urge to pry or interrogate Ethan about his time with his father. Her recordings were as much for posterity as for legal ammunition. She wanted Ethan, years later, to know that his emotional well-being had always been her guide. Maggie also kept a folder dedicated to contradictions, moments when Eric's promises didn't match reality. He often boasted, in court and to mutual acquaintances, that he was involved in every aspect of Ethan's life, but his messages proved otherwise. Missed parent-teacher conferences, forgotten sports games, moments when he deferred to Catherine's travel schedule. One day, after a tense exchange, where Eric berated Maggie for not dressing Ethan in designer clothes, she quietly snapped photos of Ethan's well-worn, but clean, practical, and much-loved wardrobe, complete with his favorite superhero pajamas. These, too, she cataloged, knowing that details define the truth. Whenever Eric's mask began to slip, Maggie noted it down. After certain visits, Ethan would act out. Nothing dramatic, but subtle signs of stress. Insomnia, nervous habits, reluctance to answer the phone when Eric called midweek. Maggie made sure to log every conversation with teachers and the school counselor, who also noticed small shifts in Ethan's behavior. With their permission, she collected written statements, painting a picture of a boy longing for steadiness, not extravagance. Some evenings, as Maggie filled out court forms or uploaded screenshots, she wondered if she was becoming paranoid or bitter. But her friend Susan, a seasoned social worker, remained her anchor. This isn't about catching Eric out of spite. It's about drawing the line between appearances and real nurture. You're showing who Ethan depends on, day after day. That comfort sustained her on late nights, when paperwork and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm. In time, Maggie gathered more overt evidence, too. She saved voicemails from Eric, sometimes tinged with impatience, when Maggie pushed back on schedule changes.
I can't believe this is happening.
Why does it matter if he misses his art class? That charity event is a bigger deal. She collected email threads in which Eric referenced Catherine's preferences for Ethan's schooling and activities, or commented on how a paternal family photo would impress certain circles. On social media, Maggie took screenshots when Eric and Catherine showcased Ethan at lavish events. Comments brimming with hashtags about blended families and their new chapter, despite the reality that these events often disrupted Ethan's sense of normalcy. Building her case also meant seeking corroboration. With Carmen's guidance, Maggie arranged for Ethan to spend time with a court-appointed child psychologist. She prepared Ethan for these meetings, not as depositions, but as safe spaces, a chance for him to talk openly, even if he never fully grasped the stakes. The psychologist's feedback reflected what Maggie suspected. Ethan was happiest with stability, in his own bed, surrounded by familiar routines, not bustling cocktail parties or brunches with society figures. Maggie was strategic. never malicious. She avoided confrontation, never badmouthed Eric to Ethan, and refrained from public accusations. She understood that the court was not interested in mudslinging, but in clear, empirical truth. Carmen often reminded her, judges hate drama. They want paper, dates, and evidence you can verify. Let Eric's own behavior, his words and priorities, speak for themselves. The ultimate test of her documentation came during legal discovery and mediation, when Eric's attorneys pressed their narrative that Maggie was well-meaning but overwhelmed, that Ethan needed a childhood of opportunity and refinement. Carmen methodically laid out spreadsheets, cross-referenced timestamps, and presented teacher statements, text messages, and psychological assessments. Maggie watched Eric's confidence flicker as factual detail supplanted rehearsed bravado. Through it all, Maggie maintained her dignity. She kept Ethan shielded from conflict, stuck to routines, and made their home a sanctuary inside the chaos. In these moments, she saw that her careful gathering of evidence was an act of love, not revenge, a labor designed not to destroy Eric, but to hold fast to the authenticity of her and Ethan's relationship. Even as the legal fight dragged on, Maggie felt a quiet transformation. She was no longer just surviving. She was acting with purpose. Each folder of records, each note in her journal, became a testament to her strength as a mother, a silent record of sacrifice, vigilance, and an unwavering belief in her son's right to a life defined by truth, not image. And as Maggie filed her last set of documents, she realized that, win or lose, she'd done everything a parent could do. She hadn't waged a war for pride or out of spite, but had simply, quietly, fought for the love and stability her child deserved. In the paperwork, the screenshots, and the simple act of showing up, Maggie discovered a faith in her own resilience, knowing her vigilance would always be Ethan's strongest protection. The wedding day climax. The sun hovered high above the Pacific as the guests gathered at the cliffside resort, a glass and marble marvel nestled along the ragged California coast. Eric and Catherine's wedding was the social event of the season, a spectacle gleaming with crystal chandeliers, silk canopies, and the promise of a perfectly blended future. The air buzzed with anticipation. Media vans lined the private drive, their reporters bustling for the best shot of the high-profile couple, while influential guests mingled near the manicured rose gardens, flutes of champagne in hand. From the start of the day, everything gleamed with the sheen of wealth and status. Catherine's gown trailed across imported Persian rugs. Eric, confidently charming, greeted guests with the air of a man who had finally arrived. Everywhere Maggie looked, if she'd had the heart to look, she'd have seen symbols of prosperity meant to impress the world and erase the messy awkwardness of the past. But Maggie wasn't there to admire or to protest. She moved quietly in the shadow of the main building, a folder of carefully organized documents clutched in one hand, her lawyer, Carmen, beside her. She hadn't wanted to do this. Even the night before, Maggie had rehearsed every scenario in her mind, struggling with doubt and fear. But the custody battle, the persistent attempts to recast Ethan in another family's image, and the relentless manipulation had cornered her into action. This wedding was more than a celebration. It was the final performance in Eric's campaign to claim Ethan for show, not for love. As the ceremony hour approached, the scene stiffened into a tableau of expectation. In the grand ballroom, garlands of blush roses framed a gleaming aisle. Cameras snapped as Catherine and her entourage, socialites, philanthropists, and minor celebrities, glided into the front rows. Ethan stood
Johnson.
nervously near the altar in a pressed suit, much too formal for his liking, fidgeting with the knot of his tie, eyes searching uncertainly for a familiar anchor. Maggie watched from the threshold, adrenaline burning through her as the wedding planner signaled for the processional music to begin. She could see Eric and Catherine, radiant and composed, ready to stride into the next chapter of their lives. The minister cleared his throat and addressed the guests to settle. Then, perfectly timed, Maggie entered the room. The chatter faltered. The whir of cameras paused, microphones straining to catch her name as she walked forward with Carmen at her side. Maggie didn't look at anyone except Ethan, who saw her, and his worried eyes softened. That glance alone renewed her strength. A hush swept the room, the tension almost palpable. "Excuse me," Maggie said, her voice steady but clear. She turned to face the minister, then the audience, raising the folder. "Before these vows are spoken, I have information that this court and this family deserves to hear." Eric's face drained of color, his smile faltering just long enough for the crowd to notice. Whispers ricocheted among the guests. Carmen stepped forward now, her legal presence impossible to ignore, as she handed copies of Maggie's evidence package to the minister and to a few prominent family members and reporters near the front. "On behalf of Ms. Johnson and her son Ethan, I feel obliged to clarify certain misrepresentations about Mr. Johnson's intentions and suitability for full custody, especially given the public nature of these proceedings." Catherine glared at Eric, her hand tightening around his arm. The minister, caught between decorum and the growing interest of the audience, glanced through the material before him. It contained documented texts revealing Eric's manipulation of visitation for photo opportunities, emails emphasizing image over Ethan's well-being, teacher statements about Ethan's stress, and detailed records disproving Eric's earlier claims of consistent and genuine involvement in his son's life. A reporter called out, "Ms. Johnson, is this true?" A camera clicked. Phones were already buzzing with updates to social media. The spectacle Eric had engineered suddenly threatened to undo him in real time. Maggie didn't gloat. She spoke with a quiet steadiness, addressing the crowd more as a mother than an adversary. "My only concern is Ethan's welfare. I don't want revenge or to ruin anyone's happiness. I just want the truth known. For my son's sake, this is not about shame, but about what a child truly needs: authenticity and stability, not performance." The effect was electric. Several guests, previously enchanted by the fairy tale romance, frowned as they read the evidence in their hands. Some shot accusing looks at Eric. Others whispered behind Catherine's back. The minister, caught in an ethical quandary, called for a brief recess, leading Eric and Catherine into a side room for urgent consultation. Left in the suddenly oxygen-thin ballroom, guests digested the reality. The press surged forward. Carmen shielded Maggie and Ethan, helping them to a private corner. Ethan, trembling, was folded into Maggie's arms. "You were brave, Mom," he whispered, safer now than he'd felt in weeks. Inside the corridor, raised voices leaked from behind thick doors. Catherine accusing Eric of ruining her reputation. Eric insisting it was all a misunderstanding. The wedding planner stood in the hallway, pale, unsure whether the event could be salvaged. What had been planned as a coronation of wealth and unity fractured in an afternoon. Some guests slipped out discreetly, shocked at the revelation. A few offered Maggie quiet encouragement as they passed. Others, still processing, only stared. Eventually, the doors opened, and Eric, diminished, addressed the room. The marriage ceremony was postponed indefinitely. Catherine left first, surrounded by her family in a flurry of camera flashes, her carefully constructed world tilted into scandal. Maggie, relieved but emotionally spent, didn't stay to watch the fallout. She led Ethan out to the terrace overlooking the sea, breathing in the cool, salty air. The crisis behind them, but the future still uncertain. Carmen promised the sudden turn of public sentiment would help their custody case. But what mattered most to Maggie was Ethan's hand in hers. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Maggie stood quietly, her son nestled at her side. She wasn't triumphant. Her heart ached for the necessity of drama and exposure. But she was at peace with her actions. Maggie had brought truth into the light, dismantling the fiction at the heart of Eric's campaign, and finally reclaimed the narrative of her own motherhood. From the embers of a ruined spectacle, she and Ethan stepped back into the world outside. The cameras would chase headlines for days, but Maggie knew that her strength wasn't in public vindication. It was in the ordinary, everyday courage to fight for her son's best interests. Together, mother and son left the glittering chaos behind, heading home toward an uncertain but honest new chapter. Ending and renewal. In the days after the tumultuous wedding, a hush seemed to fall over San Francisco. The media, insatiable for scandal, briefly lit up with headlines about the Johnson-Bell affair. Paparazzi snapshots of a jilted Catherine, blurry images of Eric avoiding questions, and a few blurry frames of Maggie and Ethan, hands clasped, leaving through a side door at sunset. But attention, as always, quickly shifted onto the next drama of the city, leaving the real people to live on with the pieces of their lives. Maggie found that the aftermath was not one loud, triumphant victory, but rather a slow, quiet settling. There was no parade, no standing ovation, only the gentle return of routine's rhythm. The tension that had gripped her world for months loosened. She slept a little easier, woke with less dread. In her small apartment, morning sun poured in as usual, casting golden ribbons across the kitchen table, where Ethan colored and Maggie sipped her coffee. The court proceedings following the halted wedding unfolded, for once, without spectacle. Carmen, ever steady, guided Maggie through a handful of hearings and mediation sessions, now bolstered by the public unraveling of Eric's mask. The evidence Maggie had so carefully compiled spoke for itself. Teacher testimonies, counselors' notes, Ethan's own quiet words about feeling at home with his mother. Even the most skeptical judge now saw the truth behind the glossy photos and lavish promises. Eric, battered by public embarrassment and the collapse of his social ambitions, no longer fought as fiercely. Catherine, dealing with scandal and the collapse of her own public image, withdrew her interest in building any blended family. The legal teams came to a resolution. Maggie retained primary physical and legal custody of Ethan. Eric was granted structured visitation, subject to Ethan's comfort and readiness. There would be no more surprise overnight demands, no more strings pulled for photo ops. The day the final custody judgment was read, Maggie did not cry. She sat straight, muscles coiled in readiness, until Carmen gently squeezed her hand. "It's done," she whispered. Maggie nodded, relief and exhaustion mingling in equal measure. But the true ending was not at the courthouse. It was in the small, ordinary moments that followed. The mornings when Ethan woke without fear of having to perform for strangers. The evenings spent reading stories twice over, just because he asked. Maggie suddenly rediscovered what it meant to be present, to live without a storm of anxiety, always at her back. She also saw changes in Ethan. Freed from the constant push and pull, the photo shoots and parties, her son became lighter, his giggle truer, his eyes brighter. He ran home from school, bursting with stories. Sometimes he would pause, uncertainty flashing in his gaze, and ask, "Is everything okay now, Mom?" Each time, Maggie would pull him close and assure him, "We're safe, sweetheart. We're home." Yet, renewal did not come all at once. The months of vigilance, court hearings, and emotional battle left scars. Maggie found herself startled by small things: a knock at the door, the sound of a text message from an unknown number. She felt a tremor in her confidence, a lingering sense she had to keep watch for the next threat. For a while, she kept the folders of evidence, printed emails, journals, notes from counselors, locked in a cabinet. It was Carmen who finally said, "Don't let these reminders weigh you down. You did what you had to do. Now let yourself breathe." Renewal was a slow, conscious process. Maggie allowed herself long walks on foggy city mornings, tracing familiar paths through Golden Gate Park and letting the city's colors, bright murals, bustling markets, children's laughter, remind her that life was more than conflict. She reconnected with Susan, not through whispered strategy sessions, but over cups of tea, sharing stories about their children or quiet victories at work. Neighbors who had once avoided her gaze now greeted her warmly. One evening, as rain pattered against the window, Maggie brought out an old family photograph, one from the first year after Ethan was born, before the world had turned upside down. They were in a park. Ethan, a toddler, clung to her neck while she laughed, hair wind-tossed and eyes bright. The picture was a reminder of all she'd preserved through the turmoil. Not perfection, but love. Slowly, Maggie began to look forward rather than back. Empowered by her experiences, she decided to enroll in night classes again, dusting off her old dreams of pursuing a full-time accounting career. She wanted Ethan to see that not only did her mother fight for him, but she also continued to grow for herself. For Ethan, the renewal was even more profound. The anxiety faded. He flourished at school, made new friends, and settled into a steadier rhythm. Maggie encouraged him to join the city soccer league, watched him chase goals across muddy fields, and stood side by side with other parents, no longer the subject of gossip, but simply part of the neighborhood fabric. She volunteered at school events, baked cookies for charity sales, and discovered a quiet pride in simply showing up. Eric, for his part, became a shadow, present for visitation, but stripped of his illusions. He no longer wielded his relationship with Ethan as a prop. Occasionally, Maggie glimpsed traces of real effort in their interactions. Hesitant, perhaps, but genuine. She encouraged Ethan to maintain a relationship with his father, reassuring him that love was not a competition, nor something to be earned by pleasing others. Renewal, in the end, was not about vengeance, victory, or even vindication. It was about reclaiming their story, the ability to live honestly, to embrace the messiness of life, and to find meaning in the ongoing, everyday acts of care. For Maggie, it meant embracing her struggles and successes equally, knowing she had done her utmost for her son. As San Francisco rolled through another foggy season, golden light sometimes spilling across the city's hills, Maggie stood on her apartment's porch, watching Ethan play with neighborhood friends. She felt gratitude, a simple, abiding joy in the life they'd rebuilt. There would be challenges ahead, but Maggie walked forward with the quiet certainty birthed through hardship, that happiness wasn't found in the absence of pain, but in the courage to begin again. They created new rituals, new memories, late-night laughter over board games, family dinners with neighbors. Saturday mornings spent exploring hidden city corners. The specter of the legal battle faded, replaced by an enduring sense of hope. In her private moments, Maggie wrote in her journal, not as evidence for any court, but as a testament to her strength and the tenacity of the bond she shared with her son. And so, renewal was not a leap, but a gentle unfurling. Maggie and Ethan moved forward, day by ordinary day, living proof that a family's true strength is found not in glossy perfection, but in resilience, tenderness, and the refusal to give up on each other or on themselves.